With that, we're going to kick off our webinar, Decoding the Unadjusted Pay Gap. What are the causes and what are areas that your company can control or contribute to? So before we kick off the conversation, I did want to give a quick overview of who we are at Syndio and why we're uniquely situated to host this conversation. Syndio provides expert-backed technology that helps companies measure, achieve, and sustain workplace equity. And we're incredibly lucky to work with more than 320 customers, representing 30% of Fortune's most admired companies. They rely on our platform as well as our expertise team to help them close pay and opportunity gaps, mitigate legal risk, and turn talent goals into tangible results. We're often sought by our customers through guidance of understanding what is happening in the workplace landscape. How do we think about topics that our employees are asking us about, our leaders are asking us about, we're hearing about in legislation? And one such topic is the unadjusted pay gap. It's not a new metric, but it's definitely one that's been heating up recently. And we're seeing a lot of pressures that are driving a conversation around it and why we should be thinking about it. To help us with this conversation, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ani. Now, Ani is the president and CEO of the Center on Executive Compensation, as well as the senior vice president of the HR Policy Association. She joined the association in January of 2012 from Global Payments Incorporated, where she was the vice president of global compensation and benefits. She has almost 2 decades of experience in compensation and human resources. And in her current role, she's responsible for overseeing the center's practice on a wide variety of executive compensation and governance issues. And she's a frequent speaker and writer on these topics. Ani, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
For my own introduction, my name is Katie Bardaro. I'm the Chief Customer Officer here at Syndio, which means I have the distinct honor of working hand in hand with our customers on their workplace equity strategies. I also happen to be an applied labor economist who's worked in the workforce analytics space, primarily in HR tech, for nearly 2 decades. So to begin, both Ani and I thought it would be helpful to provide an overview of the pressures around disclosing pay gaps. And the thing that's important to note is it is coming from all angles. I'm sure many of you are feeling that, and that is a true feeling. It's everything from legislation and activist investors to your own employees and even your peer organizations. And one area that's particularly turning up the heat when it comes to pressure in the regulatory landscape is the EU directive. The EU directive will require public pay reporting, including pay gaps, for all employers with at least 150 employees in the EU. The directive is going to modify and or add pay gap reporting for 27 of the 32 countries in Europe. And now it might be true that you see on the slide that the first reports aren't due until June of 2027, but that has to be based on 2026 data, which means that there's at most 2 compensation cycles, and for many, only 1 compensation cycle left to get ready. Another pressure that we're seeing is the potential return of EEO1 component 2. So Ani, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how does this relate to the pathway for disclosing unadjusted pay gaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think most of you on the phone here are, boy, I'm showing my age now, on the webinar here are very familiar with EEO1 component 1 data. So we all send our EEO1 reports to the EOC every year, and they show gender and ethnicity across job categories, 10 job categories. So a couple of years ago, the EEOC said it was going to start collecting component 2 pay data from companies. And so basically you had that same EEO1 form, but now you're talking about you're basically doing it by pay decile, or however, whatever category the pay was. And you're basically saying, okay, so now I can pull from this, I can say, here's the percentage of people making the top pay band in this company. There's going to be a lot more white men in that band than, let's say, women or people of color. And so you're able to sort of get at a pay gap that way. So that was just one time that the EEOC collected that data. It was a ginormous mess, as many of you who participated are well aware. They didn't give enough time. They didn't give enough explanation. A lot of the data wasn't properly audited. Even they knew that the data they got back was a mess. And then the Trump administration came and they stopped collecting it. So they've now said that they're interested in restarting that collection. And so what they did to prepare for that was they commissioned a study. Actually, I participated in that. where the study was supposed to basically look at what was the quality of the data that was collected, and should we be collecting this data, and is it necessary? And so the general conclusion of the study was that the data was a mess. It was not good. It needs to be cleaned up. The process needs to be helped changed. But at the end of the day, it's very necessary to pay equity for companies to have to disclose this, and the EEOC is the one to do it. That was sort of the result of the study. So we've all been waiting. The EEOC has a Democratic majority, and they will have that until 26. So we've all kind of been waiting, like, what are they waiting for? So in the meantime, California, Illinois have these state laws that have come out about having to submit component 2 pay data to the state. The EEOC, you might have seen a couple of weeks ago, launched an interactive database using that 2017 component 2 pay data, where you can look at it in aggregate. You can look at by industry, location, they had the, shocking headline. It was something like women make less than men. I mean, it wasn't anything that anybody would be surprised by. But I think all of those things are sort of like steps forward. They have made it very clear that this is of top interest to them. Having said that, I don't think it's going to come out this year. So any of you that were wondering about that, I don't think that's going to come out this year. The EEOC, first of all, we just had a change to how race and ethnicity are going to be handled. You may have seen, so instead of having, Hispanic as sort of like this separate category of ethnicity and not in race, that's going to be changed. There's going to be a new category for Middle Eastern and North African. So I think they may have been waiting for some of that, because that's going to change the way that we submit data to the EEOC. But I do think this is coming. And so I think that where this is relevant to us is, yes, you're only submitting it to the government. A couple of things about that. There could be the potential at some point that an enterprising reporter figures out a way to get them to submit that data under a Freedom of Information Act request. And if that happened, then the reporter would clearly write a ginormous New York Times article about it, releasing all this data. But number two, which is even more likely, is that investors like Arjuna Capital would immediately glom onto the fact that we are now all sending standardized reports to the EEOC that include pay data, that is a way to get at the pay gap, the unadjusted pay gap for that company. And the same way that they did with the EEO1 report, where they had these very successful campaigns where they said, hey, you're already submitting this data to EEOC. What do you have to hide? Why not just, disclose it publicly? It's zero cost to you. That was a very successful campaign. Now the vast majority of the S&P 100, almost all the S&P 100 do disclose their EEO1 forms publicly. So I think companies would push back on it, because obviously it's a much bigger deal to be disclosing something that could get to a raw unadjusted pay gap. People are going to draw a lot of conclusions from that, but I think it's a distinct possibility.
Great. Thanks, Ani.
That was a lot. Sorry.
No, super informative. Thank you for sharing that, and the study especially informative. So if we move beyond the regulatory pressure, something else I did want to highlight is the increased pressure from activist investors. Many of you on this conversation are probably aware of Arjuna Capital. They just very recently released their annual racial and gender scorecard that grades companies primarily on disclosures as well as commitments to future disclosures. And this year they nearly doubled the number of included companies from 68 to 129. And for many organizations, they have not been disclosing, and so were graded with pretty low grades, Fs and Ds, because it is focused on that transparency component of the work that's being done by these organizations. And that pressure in and of itself is something Arjuna has noted is resulting in more and more companies reporting pay gap data. And oftentimes what we tell our customers is people are building a story or a narrative about you, so you have the opportunity to own that narrative, to drive that story, versus kind of staying back and not reporting what the results could look like when someone else reports them for you.
Yeah,
Ani,
Katie, I think too, one thing I was just going to add to that is in that scorecard, one thing that Arjuna sometimes tends to do is their incentive is to make it sound like everybody but you is doing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and sometimes that's true and sometimes it isn't. So when they talk about, companies reporting quantitative pay gap data, they don't always talk about who's reporting unadjusted racial and gender pay gap. So, and just, I'm sure everybody on the phone knows this. there's equal pay for equal work, which is what a lot of companies do talk about publicly and say, we have a zero pay gap, let's say, because for people who are doing the same work on an adjusted basis, we're going to adjust for tenure, you can adjust for qualifications, you can adjust for performance. But what Arjuna is talking about is median female pay versus median male pay. And, so you don't get to adjust for anything. Those people could have totally different qualifications and backgrounds. All they're looking at is that median number. That's much rarer for companies to disclose. So right now, out of that top 100 that they're looking at, only 15 companies report on that. And another 7 have agreed to do so in the next year. Almost all of them because they got a direct shareholder proposal. In some cases, it may even have been voted on. So the only one that like last year, Kroger had 51% support on a shareholder proposal to disclose this. Most of the shareholder proposals that go to a vote lose by a huge margin. So I think it's just important to call that out. What Arjuna will do, if any of you have gotten that proposal from them this year, is they will make it sound like everybody is negotiating this away and all your peers are disclosing this publicly, and why aren't you? And if it goes to a vote, oh, it's definitely going to pass. The fact of the matter is that hasn't been the case. But I think that the more people that do it, obviously, then there's going to be much more pressure, especially within a peer group. That's how they were so successful on the EEO1 campaign, is by essentially attacking an industry at a time and saying, okay, well, you're in financial services. These 8 of your peers have already agreed to this. Why not you? Then it's much more difficult for the company to push back.
Yeah, that's great, Ani. And actually leads us to the next part of the conversation, which is this unadjusted pay gap. What is it? What drives it? How do we think about the different components that are informing it? And, just to ensure everybody's thinking about it in the same way, the unadjusted pay gap that we're talking about in today's conversation, we're comparing the typical earnings for all working women to the typical earnings for all working men. So not just full-time working men and women, not just professional, working men and women, but all working men and women. And when you do that, the currently unadjusted gender pay gap in the US is nearly 73 cents on the dollar. And we wanted to talk through the different components of the Syndio research, which was recently featured in Bloomberg, that decomposes the different elements that are driving that remaining gap that exists. So when we're thinking about what drives this unadjusted pay gap, we're going to talk about each of these components and what is operations that you at your organization can do to try and address these different components. But before we do that, we wanted to have a poll question for the audience to just really get a sense of where are all of you on your journey. As Ani mentioned, there is pressure, but it is still a little more rare to disclose your unadjusted pay gap. So we thought it'd be helpful for this conversation to see, where do you stand? Where do you and your organization stand? So a poll should have popped up on your screen. Please take an opportunity to choose the selection that's most appropriate for you. We'll give everybody a little bit of time to read through the answers before we share the results.
This is actually great. I also would like to know the answer to this question.
Let's give probably about 15 more seconds. I know Ani and I are sitting on the edge of our seat, so excited to see how it plays out.
It better be majority B. If it's not, then we all have some work to do. Definitely should be tracking that, even if I don't recommend disclosing it necessarily, but should be tracking it. Okay.
Great. Okay, so Ani, you called it. Majority
Yes.
looks like majority B, 50% track their unadjusted pay gap, but do not disclose it. There is a percentage who are saying they do not currently track or disclose, but they're thinking about how to get ready for the EU directive. We are hearing that from a lot of our customers, that is a force and function for them to be thinking about how to get ready. And then a portion who are either not tracking it or on the other end of the spectrum, tracking it and reporting it. So thank you for your participation on that. Ani, any surprises from your perspective?
Um, So we had a few folks that have also mentioned that, not everybody is global, or, in certain places we have to disclose it. So we disclose it, which totally makes sense to me. I
Mhm.
think that even if you're not a global company, because of the points that I just raised, you need to be tracking this. So it's not that you're going to be forced to do it by the EU. It's that the US is going to take lessons from the EU,
Mhm.
and if the EEOC starts collecting this component too, pay data, and we wind up having to disclose that publicly, what's going to happen is it's essentially what you're going to be saying is, okay, this percentage of people making this amount of money are white versus people of color, or female versus male. So then people are going to be guessing at your pay gap is what's going to happen. So I think that's why it makes sense to track it. If you're a US only company, it still makes sense to track it in the US, and track it by ethnicity, because the potential for eventually having to disclose it publicly is so high.
I think that's exactly right. And as a data nerd, I often refer to GDPR as an example of that. GDPR is something came out of Europe, but many of us here in the US have to abide by it as we work with organizations in Europe, but also just for our own data security. I think that'll be very true with the EU directive influencing how we think in the US about these topics. Okay.
So one
And
other thing I just want to mention, we had a question about, would it be for private companies as well? So same thing here. The SEC is not going to require you to do it if you're a private company, and your investor, you may not have the same type of investor campaign, but what could easily, I mean, you also as a private company have to submit this information to the EEOC. So I think that you could have maybe some shareholders in a private company that push you to disclose this. You could have media pressure to push it. At the end of the day, I think that the large public brands are for sure going to be the initial targets of people wanting them to disclose this information. But like what
Mhm.
we see, for example, with some of these laws in other countries, like take Australia, for example, they have this law now that, you've got to disclose this information. What the media did is they went directly to companies that have primarily female customer base, and then looked at their pay gap information, and then wrote an article saying, hey, these companies target women, they want women's customer dollars, and yet they have a worse pay gap than their peers. So there could be a lot of situations in which a private company, could get swept up in that. But I think if you're like a small private company that is not very well known, it's certainly going to be less likely that you're going to have that kind of scrutiny than like a large, well-known private brand.
Yep, that's exactly right. So diving into the different components that impact the gender pay gap that we're observing, this 27 cents that remains on the dollar, we wanted to talk through each of these components and the different actions that you could potentially take at your organization to address it as you think about potentially getting ready to report your unadjusted pay gap in a future iteration of your work. The first to think about is pay inequity. So really, these are gaps that persist in the typical pay for women compared to men, even after accounting for neutral job-related factors and the fact that these individuals are doing similar work. And this does contribute 1.2 cents to that overall gender pay gap. And you might be thinking, well, that feels small. That doesn't feel super meaningful. But it's important to note that it can compound meaningfully over time, having a large impact on driving down women's lifetime earnings. The good news is this portion of the pay gap is the one that's most in your control. It's really the area where companies can exert their focus and their energy around conducting regular pay equity audits, as well as ensuring that they're setting clear guidelines on any time pay decisions, whether that be new hires or promotions or a reorganization happening at your company. And when we think about pay equity, one area that is incredibly challenging, and we hear a lot about from our customers, is how do we think about this when it comes to executive compensation? So, Ani, with your extensive background in executive comp, I thought it would be helpful for our audience for you to share what are unique challenges that you see related to pay equity at the executive level?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't talk much about that. So what's interesting about the executive pay gaps, they do exist, but again, it's the difference between equal pay for equal work and like the median pay. So if you look at median pay for named executive officers, which is like the top 5 executives in the company, and those are the executives that their pay is public, so we can really delve into like, what do they get on cash, what do they get on equity. There is certainly a pay gap. But the reason for the pay gap is because women tend to inhabit the lower paid NEO roles. So you're going to find for one thing, CHRO, right? There's going to be a lot of women in that role. General counsel, also going to be, quite common to see a woman in that role. Those roles are typically lower paid than the CEO, CFO, or even like a very big, like business president, COO type role that's going to be like a contender for the CEO. And so because there is a big gap there in terms of where men go and where women go, or even white versus people of color. So, very few African American executives in the C-suite at all compared to other ethnicities, especially compared to the percentage they make up of the population. But if you're going to see them, it's often in those support NEO roles. And so that causes a gap, but it's not one that the company can easily address. If you look at men and women in one role, so for example, there was a study a couple of years ago that looked at male versus female CEOs. The female CEOs were actually higher paid than the male CEOs. But you are talking about a very small group of women compared to the vast, vast majority of the S&P 500 CEOs being male. The fact that the few women that were in that job happened to be higher paid maybe wasn't surprising, because for one thing, in order for a woman to even get to that job, there was probably something, she probably had a really big career. There was probably something special going on with the company, and so she wound up making more than her peers. Women CEOs also get fired a lot faster than their peers. So, there's a lot of noise in that statistic. But that may not be a very helpful statistic, because it's true that once they get to the CEO role, maybe they get paid the same or they get paid even more. But the fact is that very few of them are getting to that job. So very similar to the rest of the company, it's an issue of representation, not paying people unfairly. This is the difficulty when communicating this externally, because when you hear things like female executives get paid XYZ on the dollar to male executives, it really makes it sound to the layperson observer that you are paying female executives in the same job less than men. When in fact, in the case of most companies, what they're doing is putting women in the lower paid NEO roles and putting men in the higher paid roles, or the men are gravitating toward those roles, or whatever the reason is. This is way beyond the remit of comp now. This is around, do we have this pipeline of P&L? Like the people that manage P&L are much more likely to be CEO and COO, and they're far less likely to be female. So now we have to go all the way down in the organization, looking at the pipeline of people managing businesses, rather than allowing, women to gravitate toward these support functions, because there will always be a pay gap there. But the other thing I think from an exec comp perspective to say is, these women have chosen these jobs, these men have chosen these jobs. So to the extent that women want to be CEOs, we have to support that. But it may never be possible to get a zero pay gap between male and female executives without having the CEO job be 50-50 male and female. And there may or may not be that number of women who are interested in the job. There may be for an individual company, but there may not be across the nation. So that if not, then you probably will never make it to a zero pay gap there, because you would have to have the exact same number of male and female CEOs for that to happen.
I think it's a perfect lead into the next section, which is really where we start to think about this concept of opportunity equity. And specifically for this research, we're thinking through equal access to opportunities as measured by career advancement. So in other words, we're seeing that women are failing to advance to senior management and leadership executive positions at rates proportional to men. And this is contributing a much larger 7.4 cents of the gender pay gap that we observe in this research. And what the good news is similar to pay equity, this area can be addressed through robust analyses of representation, internal mobility, really understanding what is the available talent. So to Ani's point, the available talent pool might be smaller for women in some of these jobs. So how do you reconcile that with your strategy of how you're thinking about kind of impacting or changing what your representation might look like? Organizations often focus on hiring to drive change, but we really would recommend a holistic approach that focuses on the entire employee life cycle, from hiring to promotion to retention. Because if you focus just on hiring, you typically get this leaky bucket situation where you put a lot of time, energy, and money into bringing people in, but not time, energy, and money into growing them and retaining them in the organization, and they leave. So I think it'd be great, Ani, for you to talk through a little bit something I've heard you say before, which is the importance of having a defensible strategy when it comes to setting these representation goals, making sure organizations aren't falling into quotas or unlawful biases. So maybe from your perspective, if you could share, how critical are data and analytics in developing a defensible and transparent approach to addressing opportunity disparities within organizations?
Yeah. This is something that we really work on a lot at the Center on Executive Compensation because it's something that's really on the minds of boards. So one of the things that we've seen in the past few years, sort of post George Floyd, but also even before that, like the Me Too movement, a lot of sort of social change that was focusing on opportunity gaps for men and women, but even more opportunity gaps between whites and people of color, and then especially like intersectionally. So like female executives of color, those gaps being so much greater. So one of the ways that companies thought about improving that, I mean, we're in HR, this is what we do, right? We set metrics and said, okay, one thing we can do is we can set a goal. We can set a representation-based goal, a quantitative goal that we disclose publicly. So we can set that goal and then we can even tie it to exec comp. I mean, so here we are, setting a goal. We've told the universe this is important to us. We want to double the representation of African American directors and above by 2025. But that was a goal that the company set. So the comp committee then is sort of going, well, okay, if we're setting that goal publicly, should we not be, even just for communication purposes, should we not be tying it to pay? It doesn't have to be tied to a large amount of pay, but we want to really communicate this is so important to us that we're tying it to pay. So a lot of companies did that, and the majority of large companies basically do that in some way now. And so when you listen to CHROs, they'll often say, I think this is important to moving the needle. The problem is we're now experiencing this backlash against ESG, backlash against diversity initiatives. We had a number of, there's Republican lawmakers that feel very strongly that any type of diversity goal or initiative is tantamount to a quota. So we had the Harvard decision that made it illegal to consider race in college admissions. Then a lot of lawmakers, Republican attorney general, state attorney general would send letters to large companies and said, hey, post this Harvard decision, we are coming for you. Because in our view, you setting a quantitative goal for people of color, for African American directors and above, in our view, there's no way you could achieve that goal without breaking the law. We know that you're illegally discriminating against white job applicants in order to meet that goal. The fact that you're tying it to pay makes it even worse because now you're really incenting people to break the law. And therefore, you're on notice that we're coming after you. That's pretty much all that happened. I mean, it's not like companies were hit with millions of lawsuits or, people may have called for the EEOC even to investigate them. Those things we haven't seen any real outcome or result from that, which I think is why most companies have not really changed what they're doing. They may change the way they're talking about it, but we haven't seen this like exodus of companies taking this stuff out of the plan. But back to your original question, which you asked so long ago that I went on and on about this, but if you were to come across a challenge to either your diversity initiative, the goal that you set, or the goal that you tied to executive pay, I think the way to make it defensible is to have very solid metrics and data on which those goals were based. So where companies are going to get in trouble is they have no rhyme or reason behind that goal. So they set a goal, I want to double African American directors and above. I keep using that because it's just a real life goal example. But they didn't look at their talent pool. They have no evidence that that's a goal that could reasonably be achieved. And so people will argue, well, now you're definitely going to be incenting people to break the law, right? Because you've set a goal that can only be achieved if the law is broken, versus the company saying, absolutely not. We've looked at our talent goal. We've looked at census. We've looked at what our peers do. Like, this is a completely achievable goal. So Starbucks, set a goal, 30% ethnic diversity, like through the entire workforce. To me, that was a very reasonable and defensible goal. It is totally reasonable to expect that you could have that level of diversity among baristas working in stores across the nation. So I think that is really critical in order to be able to, if there was some sort of a challenge made to you and you decided you were going to defend against it rather than just stopping the activity, right? Rather than just pulling the metric, pulling the goal, having a goal but not talking about it, something like that. If you were going to defend yourself, you got to make sure you have something to defend yourself with.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. With a number of our customers and thinking through what is their talent strategy, it helps them to refine and make sure they have data-backed goals when they're thinking about this work. And I think that shift, that movement, exactly to your point of just putting a goal out there with no rhyme or reason to one that is data-backed based off your talent strategy, the markets you hire within, where you use internal movement as opposed to external talent. That's really the shift we're seeing a lot of with our customers to make sure that the work they're doing is defensible. To that point, let's move on to some of the additional areas for deconstructing this gender pay gap. And unfortunately, these are areas that are harder for you to control. So you can have an indirect impact, but they're more of a long time horizon where you start to see kind of the returns on that impact. And then first starting with gender-based differences in part-time and part-year work. So this contributes about 9 cents to the gender pay gap. And in this case, what we encourage a number of our organizations to think about is how do you focus on implementing flexible work and structured return to work programs that are designed to support employees facing a high demands outside of work, such as child rearing or elder parent care. And I think an important note is this is very interconnected with some of the other topics we talked about. For example, a number of organizations, maybe even your own, are grappling with this return to office policy that organizations are thinking through, which puts a kind of undue pressure on those who face more of these high demands outside of work. And we had one organization we worked with who decided their return to office policy is anyone in a director above title was required to be in the office 5 days a week. And when they rolled out that policy, they noticed a distinct drop in the retention of their female directors and above, as well as a drop in the recruitment success of female directors and above. And largely that's due to the fact that women do face a higher burden of demands outside of work when it comes to outside responsibilities. And so really thinking about what are the policies that you're setting as an organization that can have impacts on how you think about the opportunities you're creating for your employees to participate in their job fully. The next section, which is, I would say, the hardest one to control with the longest time horizon, which is occupational segregation. Essentially, the concept that Ani talked about earlier with at the executive level is true, persists through multiple levels in the fact that women and men tend to gravitate towards different jobs or different industries, and the ones that tend to be dominated by men have typically higher average pay. And this is contributing 9 cents to that remaining gender pay gap. And when it comes to occupational segregation, much of what needs to happen is systematic changes before an employee even enters the labor force, or often in earlier education, as well as maybe even post-secondary education. There are some indirect actions that organizations can take to drive change, things like educational recruitment programs, opportunities to provide career shadowing or supporting internships that are cross-functional for students to learn more about fields they might not be exposed to through their family or home circumstances or through their educational programs. And then also thinking about how you address leaky bucket issues in male-dominated fields or industries, how you creating an environment or a culture that encourages individuals to bring their whole selves to work and embrace these new careers. With that being said, we're going to turn to more of a Q&A session. So we're going to take down the slides and focus on Q&A. We had one that came in from an audience panel that we'll start with, which is, if we don't have equal contribution of men and women in the labor market, how can we potentially reach 50-50 male and female? Ani, I'll turn that one to you because it relates to what you shared earlier.
Well, Katie, you actually probably know more about this than I do. I mean, I was going to say you can.
Yeah.
If you don't have, if you don't have that many women in the question is though, are you really right about how many men and women you have in the potential labor force? So usually what that is because at the end of the day, the country is 50-50 male and female, right? So usually there's something you're missing. It's either your people are not. So let's take, for example, engineering, right? Certain types of engineering where you even look at the entry level workforce, the people who are the first job in engineering, and it's like some huge percentage of male, right? So you're already kind of starting at a disadvantage here. So then you just have to keep going back. Well, where are we hiring those people from? Are we overly limiting the schools we hire them from? Are we requiring a degree where one is needed? Maybe it is needed if it's engineering. Okay, let's say it's the school. Let's go look at the graduating class at that school. So is the graduating class a higher percentage of women than what we're hiring? If so, that's an issue. Is it that there are other schools that have more women, but we're focusing on just these 5 schools that are more likely to be men? That could be a help. Okay, now we may even have to go further back, like in high school. How are we, what percentage of the graduating class is interested in engineering? I mean, it really, it can be, and we have had companies that have worked with high schools to I mean, you hear it all the time, right? Like increase STEM, women's interest in STEM, make sure that they're not getting like accidentally steered away from STEM, which we have definitely seen happen, things like that. So it may be a very like long-term thing if you're talking about a very specific job where the people that are looking for that job are like overwhelmingly male. I think though it's generally limited. So it's usually not something where like, oh, every single job in the company can only be done by men. That's going to be pretty rare. But Katie, I'm interested to hear what you say.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And often what we hear from many of our customers when we're working with them on setting their representation goals is they haven't actually fully defined what their talent strategy is to even know what is possible. And so a first step of that work is, where are you focused on hiring? Where are you focused on promoting? Are you considering internal talent? Are you considering external talent? What does that mix look like to really set and define what those goals are? It is exactly right that if you set a goal of 50-50 for an average of workforce distribution, possible. But when you start to dive into, well, what industry are you in? What functions are we talking about? What levels are we looking at? Then that very quickly drops down just because of the available talent within the marketplace. Additional question that I had for you, Ani, that I think is related just kind of as a general theme for this conversation, which is, how can companies navigate this fine line between employee and public expectations for equity and transparency, but then also this heat surrounding how they actually talk about it and address it, given some of the pressures that we talked about through this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there is a lot of heat right now in the
Mhm.
US specifically on this topic. So I'm hopeful that this will cool off a little bit. We'll like reach a new equilibrium. There's also, so there's sort of, there's 2 types of heat. There's external and internal heat. So external heat, honestly, is right now the way that companies are receiving it. A lot of it is political in nature, but which I mean by that is you can almost there's going to be, it is sort of like almost like Democratic versus Republican lawmakers and policymakers that are on opposite sides of this issue. So it is political. It's going to depend on what state you're in. There's a lot of factors there. Internally is a different story. So I think we're also seeing heat internally where you find that some populations feel left behind. They feel like now the company is inclusive for everybody but them, or they may even suspect that they themselves are not being given equal opportunity at this point, like they're being discriminated against. And so I think companies have done a lot of work in that area. There's companies that actually have like something that they refer to as like a white male ERG. They might not exactly phrase it that way, but it's like a group of people trying to get everybody on board, trying to explain that diversity and inclusivity really helps everybody and does apply to everybody and isn't just for certain groups of people. So I think all of those things are going to be really important if you're trying to avoid backlash. On the external side, there may be no way to truly avoid it. So I talked to a company last week that received dueling shareholder proposals on the same topic. So essentially it was like one side wanting more pay gap, pay equity disclosure, more, racial equity audit. The other side saying, I don't want you to focus on this at all. In fact, I want you to stop disclosing it because I think it's divisive and it's bad for shareholders. So, I mean, that type of backlash is really difficult to deal with.
Mhm. That's exactly right. And I think that's probably one of the reasons we saw the results we saw in the poll, right? Many are looking at it, but not necessarily communicating what they're seeing. A couple of questions that kind of come in from the audience as it pertains to the EU directive. Essentially, this question around, how are we thinking about this work of equal value? It is a different concept than what we're used to with the US regulations, where we think of comparable or substantially similar work. Typically within the US regulations, we're focused on what is work that has comparable levels of effort, skill, responsibility and working conditions. And oftentimes that works into some sort of combination of titles or functions or sub-functions that define that work. In the EU directive, when we're thinking about equal work for equal value, where it's typically focused on a system that is defined by either a grading system or a level system that's capturing what is the similar and required amount of work that's being done at that given level or that given grade. Annie, anything that you would add to that?
Only that you know much more about this than I do. My understanding is that also this might differ by member state. Is that
That's
right? The
exactly
way that
right.
that's going to be even trickier.
Yeah, I think the challenge with the EU directive is we have the overarching directive, but every member state can add on top of it and change and modify how they're thinking about it. Think of it very similar to the US Equal Pay Act as opposed to all of the US based state laws that have to happen. So it'll be a similar level of complexity. That's one reason why we're seeing a lot of organizations kind of start to get ready now. So they're at least prepared for what we're considering kind of the baseline preparation, which is the overall directive, and then can build upon it as member states roll out additional regulations and requirements. Okay, another question that has come in that relates a little bit to what we were just talking about, Ani, around kind of this pressure to disclose and the heat and how to balance that pressure is really thinking about, well, if we are deciding to disclose our unadjusted pay gap, but it isn't dollar for dollar, what is advice or ways to think about that? Some of the thoughts I'm happy to start with sharing is one of the important things to keep in mind is the devil is in the details. So sharing a gap as just a number in a table, for example, with no context or narrative, it would be a huge no-no. We would never recommend that. And as you just saw through this conversation, the pay gap is a very complex metric and it requires a lot of explanation. And almost every company does have room for improvement. And so by openly discussing where you stand, what are your goals and targets as driven by data, and what measures are you taking to achieve this, you really can build trust with your people, with your customers, with other stakeholders. So the most important thing to think about and work on is what is that narrative? What is your talking point? What is your story around it? And the other piece is you can leverage frontline decision makers as kind of your sounding board. And the reason we recommend that is by talking to them about your unadjusted gap and how to think about it, you will get questions. And those questions will help to be signal questions of what you might get from the broader audience so you can best be prepared. And then the other piece is when and if you do release your unadjusted pay gap, when your employees have questions, they most likely will go to those frontline decision makers first. And so you want to make sure everybody is aligned and speaking to that same narrative. Ani, anything else you would add?
No, I agree with all of that. One thing we have not completely discussed or in this call is so there's pay equity and then there's pay transparency. And so I think you kind of got at this just now when you were talking about it, but some of you may be familiar with the FAR Council's proposed rule on pay transparency for federal contractors. So any of you that are federal contractors, if that rule were to be finalized, I think it will be shortly, we submitted comments on it. Essentially, that would be a nationwide immediate pay transparency requirement. You would not have to disclose anything like an unadjusted pay gap, but you would have to disclose, the way the rule is written is very expansive. So salary, bonus, equity, overtime potential, all these things for every job that you post. And it just reminded me of it when you said it, Katie, that you're going to have to be explaining that to your employees. So they would see those jobs that get posted and the rates and all the rest of it. And so I think it's the same sort of thing that's going to come up. That rule, by the way, also has a lot of requirements on what you can and can't consider when you're determining pay. So one of the really difficult parts of that rule is that it says even if an employee or a job applicant voluntarily offers information such as, here's an equity award that I'm leaving on the table, like here's a bonus that I'm not going to get paid that you need to buy me out of, you're not allowed to ask them, you're not allowed to listen to what they say, you're not allowed to consider that information in any way when you are making their pay package. So, I mean, we were like, well, I don't know how you expect us to craft a package if we don't know what they're leaving on the table. Also had the same rule for employees that are already employed by you that you're wanting to promote. So the same would apply to them. You're somehow supposed to maintain this legal fiction that you don't know what they currently make because you're not allowed to consider it in making an offer for them laterally or something like that. So that is something that we can, I'm sure somebody just asked if you could share a resource link about it, Katie. I can send you one, or I'm sure you
Yeah.
guys have it.
Yes, great. We will drop one in the chat momentarily. One thing that you said though sparked something for me that we were hearing a lot about is in some ways we're almost pushing people to think about pay transparency as pay explainability. And the reason being that employees don't really understand fully how compensation is designed, how it's managed, how what a range, how they should interpret a range or their position in a range or what that looks like. And so a large part of getting ready for these unprecedented levels of pay transparency is really understanding why do you pay people what you pay them? Because there's research that shows it's not necessarily what people earn that drive their level of satisfaction or engagement or retention. It's why they earn what they earn. And so making sure that you're really clean and clear on what you're using to drive and set pay decisions, and then how you arm your people to talk about it is why we think pay explainability is the concept we would kind of want people to rally behind. Okay.
So we had a question here. If people usually compare themselves to other peers when they ask for increases, if we're not allowed to talk to them about that, how to manage their income or pay offer. Exactly. That's exactly why it's a not a workable rule. So the way that the proposal is drafted, you simply are not allowed to consider what they currently make. I think the idea behind it, with the thought process, you have to remember that the government does not know much about how pay is actually calculated, benchmarked, administered in a company. And so from their perspective, they're thinking, well, it doesn't matter what they make or what anybody else makes. You know what the pay range of that job should be. And so you should be offering them the pay that, based on whatever like external market benchmarking you're doing, that's the pay you should be offering them. They're not thinking through at all that it might be different by person, that, each role might be a little different. So if you have like 10, comp analysts, it might not be the same for each one. They're really thinking that it's a much more sort of black and white standard than it really is. And what they are concerned about is that this person, has lower pay than they should have already. And if you take into account what they make now, you're just perpetuating that standard by, basing it on that versus basing it on what you think the role should be paid. But all of that assumes like that you have this sort of impeccable job architecture and that every single role is sort of individually which in some companies it is individually benchmarked annually. And so it doesn't matter at all what that person is currently making. I could more see that on salary. I think with bonus and equity, it's really a much tougher thing to do. So we have pushed back hard on that, but that's what's in the proposal.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one question I actually had for you, Ani, related to this concept of pay transparency, because it's come up for us from a number of our customers, is many of the regulations are focused on posting or sharing pay ranges for new hires or for job openings, not so much for established employees. And so I'm curious, are you hearing any questions from the member organizations of HRPA, or any thoughts that people are sharing as they're trying to think about what should their approach be for pay transparency?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of companies, well, a couple of things. One is we have these state laws cropping up everywhere on pay transparency. Now we have this, contractor rule. At some point, for large companies in particular, it starts to feel like maybe we need a nationwide approach, because I would rather have that than be sort of complying with each of these rules on a state by state basis. So you have seen some companies like IBM. Oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody just asked me about human capital management. Okay, Frederick, hang on one second. So I think that companies like IBM have essentially said, we're not going to ask for salary history anywhere in any state, or we're going to start, posting salary bands on every job everywhere because we don't feel like doing this on a state by state basis. So I think that that's one big part of it. But if you do that, you're going to have these conversations with internal employees. You don't want to be in a situation where you are actually more transparent with job seekers than you are with employees internally. So that's what we have worked with a lot of companies. I know you guys have too, on, okay, well, let's talk about, what are we transparent about? We did a survey around like what percentage, it was a shockingly small percentage of companies that disclose pay bands internally. And if they did, it was really only to people in that band. So like you're able to maybe see the pay band for your exact role, but you're not able to see it for anybody else. At a lot of companies, it's just managers and above that can view that. But if you're going to start putting pay ranges on every job that you post, then will build a spreadsheet, and they'll have that information. Now you've sort of lost control of that narrative. So I think on human capital management, by the way, definitely not coming out this month. Okay, you heard it here first. Now that I said this, it will come out. I'm almost certain it will not come out. I think it will be delayed again, and I think it will be delayed until next year. So for those who don't know, human capital management would apply to all of this, because that is going to be an SEC requirement that will apply to all public companies. And it would essentially say, here's all these human capital metrics that you have to disclose publicly every year. And one of them is diversity, and it will likely be a lot like the EEO-1 report. So every public company in the US would have to disclose that. And so then I think it would just, all this pay transparency and pay equity and diversity metrics together, it would make things really, really tricky for companies. But I think it's likely to be delayed until next year, because they are very busy with climate at the moment. So that's my guess for that.
Your crystal ball. I love it.
Yes.
I think some of the questions that have come in have had a similar flavor around this concept of defensibility. And so I think it's important to know, we didn't say it directly earlier, but in all of this work, it's important to think about how you're including either your internal legal counsel or your external legal partners to help provide that oversight and that view of defensibility when it comes to how you're thinking of preparing and setting up your analyses, as well as if you're running them under privilege, and thinking about what the role that the legal team can play in that. So just want to make sure that we call that component out. In terms of another question that we have coming in, Ani, there's something around this concept of perception of employees when it comes to transparency. You touched on it a little in your last answer around thinking about making sure you think about ranges for your employees if you're posting them on job postings. But what if we move beyond pay transparency and think more about kind of these pay gaps? Is there something that you would be thinking about when it comes to how do you navigate those employee conversations if you're planning on publicly producing either your adjusted or your unadjusted pay gaps?
Yeah. So I think we can learn from the companies that have done this, that have actually disclosed, unadjusted pay gaps. They don't do it in a vacuum, like you said. So if you take a look, the list of these companies, by the way, is in the Arjuna scorecard. If you're interested to look, like Adobe, American Express, BNY Mellon, Chipotle, Citigroup, Home Depot, Lowe's, there's like a list of them. And they have a lot of context around it. They explain very carefully what the difference is between an unadjusted and an adjusted pay gap. So I think that it's very easy for folks like Arjuna, the way they write about it makes it sound like the unadjusted pay gap is the real number. The adjusted pay gap is how companies try to pull the wool over your eyes by applying a bunch of different filters to this number until it's unrecognizable, and they can tell you that there's a zero pay gap. I mean, it's just a very there's a very clear attempt to impugn the adjusted pay gap while holding out the unadjusted pay gap as like the gold standard. So I think that companies that disclose both, or if they just disclose an adjusted one, they really try to explain, hey, this is actually the number that you should care about. This is the number that it makes more sense. It's been contextualized. When we publish our financials, right, we publish them generally. I mean, yes, we have our non-adjusted financials, but we also adjust them for things that matter to provide context to, what those financial results were. They don't just occur in a vacuum. So I think they do a really good job of that internally as well as externally. I honestly have not heard from companies about huge employee pushback on pay gaps that they've disclosed. So I find that kind of interesting. I think somebody raised this point earlier about people really only caring about what they make compared to their peers. We found this with pay ratio. So, I mean, CEO pay ratio. Where there just wasn't the focus from employees on what's the gap between me and the CEO. It just wasn't, it was like, yeah, the CEO makes a lot more than me. I guess I knew that, I don't know that that's really relevant to my life. And it seems similar on these sort of like raw unadjusted pay gaps. Once it's explained to them that this is just like median pay in the whole organization, and I think the employees actually care less about that than, but am I paid fairly? That's what they're really asking. Am I paid fairly compared to my peers, compared to the people who are doing the same work that I'm doing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Humans are hardwired for fairness. So that's often what comes through in the conversations. Okay, one last question. An audience we haven't really talked much about, which is boards. So when you're thinking about these topics, whether it be the decision to report or not report, the decision to track and analyze, the decision to set data-driven goals, what are you hearing from boardrooms?
Yeah, so this is surprisingly a very big issue in the boardroom. Pay equity, pay transparency, human capital metrics, the whole nine yards. They're concerned about employees, of course, but they're also very concerned about sort of external pressures, so investors and the SEC and other regulators. I think from a board perspective, we say a lot at the center that board members are renting their reputation to the company. So they're concerned about anything that the company does that could tarnish that reputation. They're supposed to be overseeing, managing, right? Management. That's kind of their job. And so if something like that happens on their watch, so for example, if an article is written that says, oh boy, here's a company that claims they care about women and their pay gap is terrible compared to their peers, that doesn't look good for the board. They certainly don't want that New York Times article to be the first they're hearing of it.
Hmm.
So I think that's why CHROs are increasingly giving a little more information to the board. Often it's the comp committee that's looking at that. Maybe some of these internal analyses we talked about. Yes, we do a pay equity analysis every year. Here were the basic results. This year we decided to look at unadjusted pay gap, and these were the results. Here's where we have an issue. Like here's what I mean, really, they are very interested in that, so that they're not kind of taken off guard if they either get a Arjuna proposal or, something shows up in the news.
That's great. Thanks, Ani, so much for sharing that. We've covered all the various audiences you might all hear about when it comes to pay gap and pay transparency. We were really appreciative of you taking the time out of your day to join us for this conversation. As a reminder, as a registrant, you will get a copy of this recording as well as the assets that have been shared in the chat. And so we look forward to continuing the conversation. And another quick note is that Ani has another webinar that is also coming up to talk about some additional topics that might be of interest. So we'll share a link for that in the chat as well. Encourage you to attend because hopefully, as you saw from this conversation, she has a wealth of knowledge to offer. So thank you again, Ani, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their Thursday.